The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Rome as Marcus Aurelius Varro made his way through the bustling streets toward the Campus Celeratus. The very name sent shivers down his spine. The evil field. As a scribe working for the imperial archives, he had been tasked with documenting the city's most obscure historical sites for Emperor Trajan's grand chronicle of Roman traditions. But what he was about to uncover would shake him to his very core, making him question everything he thought he knew about the sacred rituals that held the empire together. If you're finding this story as fascinating as Marcus is about to find his discovery, make sure to subscribe for more untold secrets of ancient Rome. Marcus had always been a methodical man, preferring the safety of scrolls and ink to the unpredictable nature of fieldwork. Yet here he was, standing before a nondescript patch of ground just inside the ancient Servian wall near the Porta Collina. According to his research, this was where Rome's most sacred punishment had been carried out for centuries, the burial of unchaste Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins were no ordinary women, selected between the ages of 6 and 10 from Rome's most distinguished patrician families. They were sworn to serve Vesta, goddess of the hearth, for 30 years. Their primary duty was maintaining the sacred flame that burned eternally in the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. This flame was believed to be directly connected to Rome's survival. If it went out, the empire itself would fall. But what Marcus was discovering in the imperial records was far more sinister than simple flame tending. The Vestals were bound by an unbreakable vow of chastity. Any violation of this sacred oath was considered not just a personal failing, but an act of treason against the Roman state itself. The punishment for such betrayal was unlike anything else in Roman law. As Marcus examined the ground more closely, he noticed subtle depressions in the earth, evidence of ancient excavations. His hands trembling slightly, he began to dig, following the measurements he'd found in a dusty scroll from the reign of Emperor Augustus. 3 feet down, his makeshift shovel struck something solid, stone. What he uncovered was a perfectly preserved stone slab, inscribed with barely legible Latin text. As he carefully brushed away centuries of accumulated dirt, the words became clear. Hic sepulta Claudia Vestal Maxima, anno Domini LXXX. Here lies Claudia, Chief Vestal, 81 AD. Marcus felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just any Vestal Virgin, this was Cornelia, the Chief Vestal executed by Emperor Domitian. He had read about her case in Pliny the Younger's letters, but to find her actual burial site was beyond his wildest expectations. More importantly, beneath this stone slab lay the entrance to the underground chamber where she had been buried alive. The ritual was as elaborate as it was horrifying. When a Vestal was found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, she would be stripped of her sacred garments and badges of office, then publicly scourged. Dressed like a corpse, she would be placed in a closed litter and carried through the forum in a funeral procession, accompanied by her weeping relatives. The entire city would watch in horrified silence as the procession made its way to this very spot. Marcus carefully pried open the stone slab, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The Romans had designed this chamber with meticulous precision. It was technically within the city limits, because no blood could be spilled from a Vestal Virgin, and execution outside the city would have required bloodshed. Yet it was also technically not a burial, because the condemned woman was provided with bread, milk, water, and oil for a few days' sustenance. This legal technicality allowed the Romans to claim they weren't actually killing the Vestal. They were simply placing her in a room with provisions, where she would die a natural death. The psychological torture was unimaginable. Alone in the darkness, with just enough food and water to prolong the agony for several days, knowing that above ground, life in Rome continued as normal. As Marcus descended the stone steps, his torch illuminating the narrow chamber, he couldn't help but wonder about Cornelia's final moments. Historical accounts described how she had protested her innocence until the very end, crying out that Caesar Domitian should know she was pure because her sacred rituals had brought him victory in his military campaigns. When she descended these very steps, her robes had caught on a stone, and when the executioner reached out to help her, she had recoiled in disgust, maintaining her dignity and purity even in her final moments. The truth Marcus is uncovering gets even darker. Hit that like button if you're ready to learn what he found in that chamber. The underground chamber was exactly as the ancient texts had described, a small stone room, barely large enough for a person to stand, with evidence of ancient oil lamps and water vessels still scattered on the floor. As Marcus examined the space more carefully, he realized this wasn't just Cornelia's tomb. It was a purpose-built execution chamber used multiple times throughout Roman history. The weight of what he was discovering began to settle in. This wasn't simply an ancient form of capital punishment. This was a carefully constructed religious ritual designed to maintain the cosmic balance between Rome and its gods. The Vestal Virgins weren't just priestesses, they were living symbols of Rome's covenant with the divine realm. Marcus found evidence of at least 6 different burials in this chamber, spanning nearly 3 centuries. Each one told a story of a young woman who had supposedly violated the most sacred trust in Roman society. But as he read deeper into the historical records he'd brought with him, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The timing of these executions was revealing. Vestals were almost always accused of unchastity during periods of political upheaval or military disaster. When Rome faced threats from external enemies or internal strife, the authorities would suddenly discover that one or more Vestals had broken their vows. The logic was simple, but terrifying. If Rome was suffering, it must be because the gods were angry. And if the gods were angry, it must be because the sacred flame was being tended by impure hands. Take the case of 216 BC, during the darkest days of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal was ravaging the Italian countryside. 2 Vestals, Floronia and Opimia, were suddenly accused of unchastity. One committed suicide rather than face the ritual burial. The other was brought to this very chamber. Immediately after their deaths, Rome's military fortunes began to improve. A coincidence that the Senate was quick to publicize? Or consider the case of 114 BC, during a period of intense social conflict between patricians and plebeians. 3 Vestals, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were all accused simultaneously of multiple acts of unchastity. The accusations were based on supernatural evidence. A young girl of equestrian family had been struck by lightning while on horseback, which Roman soothsayers interpreted as a sign that the Vestals had angered the gods. Marcus began to understand that these women weren't really being punished for sexual misconduct. They were being sacrificed to restore Rome's relationship with the gods during times of crisis. The elaborate ritual of burial alive served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Rome's reverence for divine law, it provided a visible explanation for the empire's troubles, and it offered hope that the gods' favor could be restored through proper punishment of the guilty. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. Every citizen knew that the empire's survival depended on the Vestal's purity. When one was found guilty of breaking her vows, it confirmed people's worst fears about divine displeasure, while simultaneously offering a path to redemption. The ritual burial wasn't just punishment, it was purification, a way to cleanse Rome of the pollution that had attracted divine wrath. But Marcus was beginning to suspect that many of these women had been innocent. The evidence used against them was often flimsy at best. Minutia was condemned based on her excessive love of dress and the testimony of a slave. Postumia was suspected simply because of her immodest attire and overfamiliar manner, though she was ultimately acquitted with a stern warning. The Romans had created a system where any Vestal could become a scapegoat whenever the state needed to demonstrate its commitment to divine law. The very privileges that made the Vestals powerful, their independence, their wealth, their political influence, also made them vulnerable to accusations when Rome needed someone to blame for its troubles. As Marcus continued examining the chamber, he found something that made his blood run cold: scratch marks on the stone walls, evidence of desperate fingernails clawing at the rock. These women hadn't simply accepted their fate, they had fought against it. Even as the air in the sealed chamber slowly ran out, the Roman system was ingeniously cruel in its precision. The condemned Vestal was given just enough provisions to survive for several days, ensuring that she had time to contemplate her fate and hopefully to pray for Rome's forgiveness. The chamber was sealed from above, but a small air shaft allowed enough oxygen to prolong the agony. Death would come slowly from starvation, dehydration, or suffocation. What Marcus discovers next will reveal the most shocking aspect of this ritual. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on this dark chapter of Roman history. Marcus spent hours in that underground chamber, piecing together the full horror of what had transpired there. But it was when he discovered a hidden cavity in the wall that the most disturbing truth was revealed. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had preserved it for nearly 2,000 years, was a scroll written in a woman's handwriting. The scroll was Cornelia's final testament, written during her last days in this very chamber. As Marcus carefully unrolled the fragile papyrus, he read words that would haunt him forever. "To whoever finds this record, know that I die innocent of the charges brought against me. I have served Vesta faithfully for 27 years, maintaining the sacred flame and performing all rituals with perfect devotion. My only crime was questioning why the emperor needed 3 Vestals to die when his Syrian campaign failed. I understand now that truth is less important than the appearance of divine justice." The implications were staggering. Cornelia hadn't been executed for unchastity at all. She had been murdered for political dissent. Marcus cross-referenced this revelation with other historical records and began to see a pattern that chilled him to the bone. Every Vestal execution coincided, not just with military or political disasters, but specifically with moments when the emperor or senate needed to deflect blame from their own failures. The sacred ritual of burial alive wasn't about maintaining religious purity. It was about maintaining political control. The Vestals were powerful figures in Roman society, with significant influence over public opinion. When their criticism of imperial policy became inconvenient, they could be eliminated under the guise of religious purification. Marcus realized he had uncovered one of Rome's darkest secrets: the systematic murder of influential women disguised as religious necessity. The elaborate ritual, the careful legal technicalities, the public spectacle. It was all designed to make political assassination appear as divine justice. The scroll contained more revelations. Cornelia described how Domitian's agents had planted evidence in her quarters: love letters supposedly from a Roman knight, expensive gifts that suggested illicit relationships, even perfumes that were said to indicate vanity inappropriate for a Vestal. The trial had been a sham, with witnesses who had been bribed or threatened into giving false testimony. Even more shocking was Cornelia's description of her fellow Vestals' reactions. Some had genuinely believed the charges against her, so thoroughly indoctrinated were they in the system that justified their own power. Others knew the truth but remained silent, terrified that speaking out would make them the next victims. The system didn't just kill individual Vestals, it terrorized the entire college into compliance. Marcus found evidence that this pattern extended throughout Roman history. The three Vestals executed in 114 BC had all been vocal critics of the Senate's handling of the Jugurthine War. The Vestals killed during the Punic Wars had questioned the enormous military expenditures that were bankrupting Rome's treasury. In each case, their political inconvenience had been transformed into religious guilt through the mechanism of the sacred ritual. The genius of the system was its self-reinforcing nature. Because the Vestals held such revered positions in Roman society, their execution for unchastity was automatically seen as proof that divine law had been violated. No one questioned whether the charges were true. The very fact that such holy women had been found guilty was evidence enough. And once a Vestal was buried alive, any improvement in Rome's fortunes was attributed to the restoration of divine favor through proper punishment. Marcus began to understand why the ritual was so specifically designed. The Vestal couldn't be executed publicly like a common criminal. That would have revealed the political nature of her death. She couldn't be exiled or imprisoned. That would have allowed her to continue influencing public opinion. She had to be eliminated in a way that simultaneously demonstrated the state's religious devotion and prevented any possibility of the truth emerging. The burial alive served both purposes perfectly. It was presented as the ultimate expression of Roman respect for divine law, so sacred that the condemned woman couldn't even have her blood spilled. At the same time, it ensured her permanent silence in a way that was both physically and symbolically absolute. Buried beneath the earth, sealed away from human contact, the executed Vestal became a living sacrifice to the gods' anger and Rome's political necessities. As Marcus prepared to leave the chamber, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He carefully resealed Cornelia's scroll in its hiding place, but not before making detailed notes of its contents. This truth was too important to remain buried with its victims, but he also realized the danger he was in. If the current imperial administration discovered what he had learned, he would likely meet the same fate as the Vestals he was investigating. The system that had operated for centuries was still in place, still ready to eliminate inconvenient voices under the guise of religious or political necessity. Marcus's discovery forces him to make an impossible choice. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to see how this incredible story concludes and learn what happened to the secret that could shake the Roman Empire to its foundations.